The chandeliers of the Grand Atoria glittered like constellations suspended from the heavens, each crystal prism scattering gold and silver light across the cavernous ballroom. The air carried the sharp scent of imported lilies mixed with expensive cologne, and beneath it all lay something far more intoxicating, the smell of money. Every corner of the room pulsed with wealth, gowns stitched with diamonds, tuxedos tailored to perfection, voices raised in laughter that rang hollow beneath the orchestral music. For the city's elite, this was another Tuesday evening, a chance to parade their fortunes beneath chandeliers that had seen generations of excess. Yet, behind every smile, behind every clink of crystal glass lurked a chill, the kind of cold that came from people who could buy anything but warmth. Cassie Riley wove between them like a shadow, her black and white uniform pressed to perfection, the thin disguise of someone born to be unseen. In her hands, a silver tray gleamed beneath the light, balanced with fragile glasses of Dom Perignon, each one worth more than she would earn in an entire shift. She moved with the careful grace of someone who had practiced invisibility, each step measured, each turn seamless, her face composed into polite neutrality. To the guests, she was nothing but part of the machinery, efficient, silent, forgotten the moment they looked away. But inside Cassie's chest, a storm lived quietly. She had not always been a shadow. Once she had been a dancer who lived for the stage, who knew what it meant to feel the world hold its breath as the orchestra swelled and the spotlight fell. Tonight, though, she was invisible, her dreams folded into the corners of her apron, tucked away like secrets too painful to carry in the open. Still, in fleeting moments between tables, she could almost feel it again. The rhythm of music, the tug of the stage, the echo of applause. It was enough to sting, enough to remind her of everything she had lost. Across the ballroom, laughter erupted like champagne bubbles popping in the air. Preston Montgomery III sat at one of the front tables, a man who wore arrogance like a second skin. His golden hair was slicked into perfect place, his tuxedo pressed so sharply it could have cut glass, and on his wrist gleamed a Rolex worth more than Cassie's entire yearly salary. He leaned lazily against his chair, swirling his glass of wine as though the room itself had gathered to entertain him. Beside him sat Veronica Davenport, his fiancée, her sapphire gown glittering like ocean waves beneath the light. Her beauty was sharp, cold, and untouchable, her laughter like broken ice. Preston's friends, Blake and Austin, filled the air with boisterous voices, their chuckles spilling into the space around them as if every word they spoke deserved applause. Together, they were a tableau of privilege, polished, smug, and entirely convinced the world belonged to them. Preston's smirk carried an edge of cruelty, the kind of expression that made servants straighten their posture and guests lean closer, unsure whether to fear or admire him. From her place near the edge of the room, Cassie felt his gaze slice across the space. It was not the look of admiration or curiosity, but of appraisal, as if she were nothing more than an object, a decorative piece moving among the tables. She lowered her eyes quickly, clutching the tray tighter, her pulse rising as if the weight of that stare had pressed into her very skin. She had seen men like him before, men who believed their fortunes gave them permission to toy with those who served. But in Preston Montgomery III, there was something sharper, something colder. The orchestra's music swelled, violins crying out over the hum of voices, yet beneath the glitter and the grandeur, there was tension, something unsaid, something waiting. It lingered in Preston's smirk, in Cassie's tightened grip on her tray, in the cold air that swirled beneath the chandeliers. The night was only beginning, and already the lines of power and pride had been drawn. No one in that ballroom could have guessed that by the time the night ended, it would not be Preston Montgomery they remembered, but the invisible waitress who had carried champagne with perfect grace, and who, in one breathtaking moment, would shatter his arrogance before them all. The ballroom's noise faded from Cassie's mind as she moved toward the next table, her smile practiced, her steps precise. But behind the smooth facade of service, her heart carried the weight of something far heavier than the champagne on her tray. That very morning, she had sat at her tiny kitchen table in Queens, her fingers trembling as she tore open an envelope stamped with the crest of the Donovan Academy of Arts. For a moment, her chest had filled with wild, impossible hope. But then she saw the words, "The committee regrets to inform you," each syllable carved into her chest like a blade. It was not the first rejection, but it was the cruelest. It reminded her of the dream she had once held so tightly, and the brutal truth that she was never meant to hold it again. Cassie had once lived for the dance. At 17, she had stepped into the studio every morning with a hunger in her chest and music in her blood. She had earned her place at Donovan Academy not through connections or money, but through raw talent, years of sweat, and a determination that outshone every obstacle. Her father, James Riley, had been her fiercest supporter, working endless hours at his construction job just to afford her uniforms, her shoes, the bus fare to rehearsals. She could still remember the day the acceptance letter arrived, how her father had placed it on the breakfast table with a grin so wide it nearly split his face. "Cass, sweetheart," he had whispered, wrapping her in his strong arms after she screamed with joy. "I always knew you were born for the stage." That moment had lived inside her like a flame. She carried it into every rehearsal, every leap, every pirouette. She believed, with the unshakable faith of a child, that her life would open into a future of dazzling lights and thunderous applause. But fate, cold and merciless, had other plans. She had been in rehearsal the afternoon her world fell apart. Her mother's voice cracked through the phone. "Cassie, your father, he's been in an accident. Construction site. They're rushing him into surgery." She ran from the studio, still in her leotard, her ballet slippers pounding against the hospital floor. The sight of her father lying beneath fluorescent lights, his body broken, machines beeping around him, it seared her heart. The doctors explained what words like long-term care, rehabilitation, and permanent injury really meant. Her father would never walk the same way again. The bills piled up faster than hope. Her mother's tears filled the nights, and Cassie, faced with the impossible choice between her dream and her family, made the only decision she could. She left Donovan Academy. She folded her white tutu and pink point shoes into a drawer, each thread of fabric a tiny coffin for the life she was giving up. The scholarship board had been kind at first, offering her extensions, second chances, but eventually came the final call. "If you don't return soon, your place will be revoked." She had begged for time, begged for mercy, but the world gave her none. Now, years later, she was here, in a ballroom full of laughter and diamonds, dressed in black and white, carrying glasses instead of dancing beneath the light. Her father lay in their cramped apartment, his pride bruised but his spirit somehow unbroken. She worked endless shifts, not for herself but to keep him alive, to pay bills that never stopped. Yet no matter how many steps she took across these polished marble floors, she never escaped the echo of the stage she had lost. As she adjusted the tray in her hands and slipped between tables of laughing millionaires, the orchestra's music drifted into her veins like a cruel reminder. For a heartbeat, she closed her eyes and felt her body sway, the ghost of Swan Lake whispering through her. In that fleeting second, she wasn't a waitress. She was a dancer again, poised beneath a spotlight, her father's proud eyes shining in the audience. Then a harsh voice snapped her back. "Careful with that tray, Riley," her manager, Mrs. Peterson, hissed quietly as she brushed past. "These people notice everything." Cassie nodded, masking the storm in her chest with a polite smile. But inside, she was already breaking. She had learned long ago that the world of the wealthy thrived on blind cruelty. To them, she was invisible, until she slipped, until she faltered, until they could twist her into their entertainment. And on this night, with Preston Montgomery's cold eyes already fixed on her like a hawk circling its prey, Cassie had no idea that her invisibility was about to end. The girl who had buried her dreams beneath years of pain was about to step back into a spotlight she thought she'd lost forever, dragged there not by choice, but by arrogance, cruelty, and fate itself. Cassie had just finished pouring water into a crystal goblet at table 12 when she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Not the casual glance of a guest, not the vacant look of someone who hardly noticed her presence, but a sharper, colder kind of gaze. It pressed against her skin like ice, making the hairs on her arms rise even beneath the crisp sleeves of her uniform. She forced herself to smile politely at the guest she was serving, but when she looked up, her breath caught. Across the table, lounging with careless ease, sat Preston Montgomery III. He was the man. A kind of man whose wealth was written into every inch of his posture, the way he leaned back in his chair, the way he swirled his champagne as though it were a prop meant only to display the glint of his cufflinks. His features were handsome in the way polished marble is handsome, flawless, cold, untouchable. Golden hair slicked to perfection, jaw sharp, blue eyes the shade of steel that never warmed. Cassie had never seen him before, but she knew his type immediately. She had seen his reflection in every privileged man who had ever treated her like furniture. At his side sat Veronica Davenport, his fiancée, draped in sapphire silk that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Her beauty was undeniable, but it carried a certain chill, the kind that warned others to keep their distance. Her laughter rang out like broken glass as Preston leaned toward her, murmuring something just loud enough for Cassie to hear. "Look at them," Preston said, his voice dripping with mockery. like little wind-up dolls, no soul, no spark, just bodies moving through the room. Veronica chuckled softly, her hand brushing his arm as her lips curved into a cruel smile. At least they're useful, she said, her eyes flicking toward Cassie for only a heartbeat before sliding away as though she were no more important than the dust on the marble floor. The words sank into Cassie's chest, sharp as needles. Her hand trembled slightly on the pitcher, but she caught herself quickly, her manager's voice echoing in her head. Never react. Keep your head high, Riley. They can smell fear. She forced her expression to remain smooth, her voice steady as she whispered, "Will that be all for you tonight, sir?" Preston didn't answer immediately. He let his gaze linger, roaming over her from head to toe with the kind of disdainful appraisal one might give a painting they had no intention of buying. His smirk witted, Enid feeding off the silent tension in the air. Blake and Austin, his ever-present companions in luxury, leaned closer, sensing the game beginning. Finally, Preston tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into something that was neither smile nor sneer, but a mix of both. "Tell me," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "what's your name?" Cassie swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry, but her voice did not waver. "Cassandra Riley, sir." He repeated her name slowly, savoring each syllable as though mocking its sound. Cassandra Riley. Such a lovely name for such a lowly job. Blake and Austin burst into laughter, their voices breaking through the polite murmur of the ballroom. A few guests turned their heads, curious, their eyes darting between Preston and the young waitress standing frozen at his table. Cassie's cheeks burned, but she kept her posture straight, her expression calm. She had been humiliated before, but something about the sharpness in his tone cut deeper than usual. "Oh, Preston, don't be too harsh," Veronica said, her voice silky with false sympathy. "She's doing her best." Yet the look in her eyes held no kindness. It was cold, detached, as if Cassie's dignity were nothing more than a source of mild amusement. Preston's smirk deepened. He pointed at the tablecloth, at a droplet of water so faint it could barely be seen. "Well then, Cassandra, perhaps you'd care to explain why there's a stain on my table?" Cassie followed his finger, her stomach nodding. The droplet had likely fallen from his own glass, but that didn't matter. She knew exactly what he was doing, twisting nothing into something, wielding his power not because he could, but because he wanted to. Around them, the air shifted. Conversations grew quieter. The ballroom seemed to lean in, curious to watch how far he would go. Cassie's heart pounded, but she lowered her eyes respectfully. "My apologies, sir. I'll clean it right away." She reached for a napkin, desperate to escape the moment, but Preston raised a hand, halting her with a gesture sharp enough to cut. "No, Cassandra," he said, his voice pitched so everyone nearby could hear. "I don't think the problem is the table. The problem is your attitude." The words sliced through her, cruel and deliberate. Veronica's smile glistened with satisfaction. Blake and Austin laughed again, their voices blending with the growing murmur of the crowd. Cassie clenched the napkin in her hand, her composure trembling on the edge of collapse. "Perhaps," Preston continued, his tone low and dangerous, "this job is too complicated for you. Maybe you should stick to fast food counters or janitorial work." The laughter swelled, rippling across the tables like fire spreading through dry grass. Cassie felt her chest tighten, her pride screaming, but still she kept her voice steady. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll be more careful." Preston reclined back in his chair, smugness radiating from every inch of him. His friends laughed louder, satisfied with the spectacle. But Cassie, even as she turned away with her dignity bruised and her heart aching, felt something stir deep inside her. Something that had been buried for years, something fierce, unyielding, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And Preston Montgomery III, so confident in his power, had no idea he had just lit the match. The clinking of crystal glasses and the hum of polite conversation filled the Grandatoria ballroom, but at Preston Montgomery's table, silence was already starting to thicken like smoke. Cassie stood frozen, her hand still hovering with the napkin she had been about to use, her eyes lowered, though her heart was thundering. She knew she had to walk away, to disappear back into the sea of servers and pretend the humiliation had never happened. That was the rule of survival in rooms like this. Never give them more than a smile. Never let them see your pride. But Preston wasn't finished. He had caught the scent of vulnerability, and he wasn't about to let it go. "Wait!" His voice rang out suddenly, sharp and commanding enough to halt her in her tracks. The sound cut through the orchestra's delicate strings, turning heads at the neighboring tables. Cassie stopped mid-step, her back stiffening, the napkin clutched so tightly in her hand her knuckles turned white. She turned slowly, every muscle in her body braced against the storm she knew was coming. Preston leaned forward in his chair, his eyes gleaming with the cruel delight of a predator who knew the entire room was watching. "Tell me, Cassandra," he drawled, his voice rising just enough to carry across the ballroom. "What do you think this job requires? Skill, patience, grace, or is it simply the ability to carry a tray without spilling?" A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Not everyone joined in. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the cruelty brewing, but enough chuckled to feed Preston's arrogance. Veronica covered her smile with her hand, her jeweled fingers sparkling as if her laughter was just another accessory. Blake and Austin roared, pounding the table with the glee of spoiled children watching a puppet show. Cassie swallowed hard, forcing her voice to remain calm, her posture steady. "My job, sir, is to serve respectfully and without disturbance. If I have made an error, I will correct it." Her words were measured, polite, an attempt to end the spectacle, but Preston wasn't seeking respect. He was seeking submission. His smirk widened, and his voice turned colder. "Respectfully? Cassandra, do you truly believe respect is something you can give from where you stand? You, in that uniform, serving tables? No, respect is reserved for those who earn it." His words struck like slaps, each one echoing in the heavy silence that followed. Cassie felt heat rise in her cheeks, her pride screaming to fight back, but her father's voice rang in her memory. "Never let them break you, Cassie. You are more than their cruelty." She forced her chin higher, though her throat ached with unshed tears. "Of course, sir," she whispered, her tone steady despite the fire raging inside her. But Preston leaned back, swirling the wine in his glass, his smirk never fading. "Do you see, ladies and gentlemen?" he said loudly, gesturing toward Cassie as though she were a specimen on display. "This is what passes for service these days. Fragile pride wrapped in starched linen. They forget their place." The ballroom fell eerily quiet. Guests shifted in their seats, some hiding their discomfort behind polite sips of champagne, others leaning forward with a cruel curiosity. Cassie stood at the center of it all, her dignity balancing on the thinnest edge. Veronica tilted her head, her voice sweet but laced with venom. "Perhaps she just needs a little reminder. Don't you agree, darling?" Preston's smirk sharpened. He set down his glass deliberately, the sound of crystal against marble echoing like a gavel. "Yes," he said, his voice cutting through the still air. "Perhaps it's time Cassandra here learns what it really means to serve the elite." Cassie's chest tightened, her fingers trembling at her side. For a fleeting second, she thought of leaving, of walking away, of escaping the ballroom before his cruelty cut deeper. But the chandeliers glittered above her like unyielding spotlights, trapping her in place. Every eye was on her. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to wait for the next cruel command from Preston Montgomery III. And in that unbearable pause, Cassie realized something. This wasn't just another moment of humiliation she could brush away. This was a line being drawn, a test not of her skill, but of her spirit, and whether she faltered or stood tall would change everything. Preston leaned back, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a man about to pull the wings off a butterfly. He tapped his fingers against the tablecloth, his smirk promising more humiliation. And as Cassie stood frozen in the glittering trap of the ballroom, her heart pounding like a drum, she understood that tonight the game was no longer about serving champagne. It was about survival and dignity. And Preston Montgomery III had just set the stage for a war he did not yet understand. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Conversations that had filled the air moments before now dissolved into silence as though the entire room sensed a storm brewing. Cassie stood at the edge of Preston Montgomery's table, her tray tucked against her side like a shield, her heart pounding in her chest. Every instinct told her to retreat, to bow her head and disappear before his mockery could sharpen into something worse. But Preston was not the kind of man who let his prey escape once he had set his eyes on them. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the tablecloth as if he were presiding over some private court. His fiancée, Veronica, perched at his side, her sapphire gown shimmering as her lips curved into an icy smile. Blake and Austin, his loyal shadows, were already grinning with cruel anticipation. Preston swirled his champagne lazily, letting the bubbles rise and break as he spoke with deliberate cruelty. "You know, Cassandra," he began, his voice pitched to carry beyond his table, "a job like yours should come with certain talents, efficiency, grace, composure. Wouldn't you agree?" A ripple of chuckles spread across nearby tables. Cassie kept her eyes lowered, every muscle in her body tense. "Yes, sir," she replied softly, her voice steady though her hands trembled against the tray. Preston's smirk deepened. "But I'm not convinced you have them. Not yet. Maybe you need a chance to prove yourself." The air grew heavier, thick with curiosity. Guests leaned back in their seats, eyes darting toward Cassie. The orchestra in the corner continued to play, but even the violin seemed muted as though the music itself were afraid of intruding on the cruel spectacle. Cassie shifted slightly, her voice careful. Sir, I assure you I take my duties seriously. If I've made any mistake, I apologize. Preston waved his hand dismissively, his tone sharpened by arrogance. Oh no, an apology won't do. I think everyone here deserves something more entertaining. He reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and, with theatrical flair, pulled out a thick stack of cash. The bills were crisp, their edges gleaming beneath the chandeliers. The sight alone drew murmurs from the guests. He held the stack high so everyone nearby could see. $10,000, he declared, his voice carried like a blade slicing through the quiet. This, he shook the cash for emphasis, is yours, Cassandra. If... He let the pause hang, savoring the tension, the eyes now fixed on him. If you dance a tango with me, right here, right now. Gasps broke out across the ballroom. A few people laughed nervously, others leaned forward with scandalized fascination. The dare was outrageous, dripping with mockery, designed to humiliate her in front of the city's most powerful. Cassie's breath caught in her chest. Her mind reeled. $10,000, enough to cover a month of her father's medical bills, enough to buy them breathing room from the suffocating weight of debt. Yet the price was her dignity. Veronica's laughter chimed like a bell, cruel and amused. Oh, Preston, she said, though her eyes glittered with delight. That's wicked. How could she possibly manage? Blake slapped the table, roaring with laughter. This is going to be priceless. A waitress dancing with Preston Montgomery. Austin's grin spread ear to ear, already savoring the show. Preston stood now, towering over Cassie, his expression a mask of smug challenge. He stepped closer, closing the space until only a breath separated them. His voice dropped lower, but still loud enough for everyone to hear. Of course, there's one condition. If you falter, if you make even one mistake, I'll make sure this is your last night working at the Grand Atoria. A stunned hush fell over the room. The chandelier light sparkled coldly across marble and silk. Dozens of eyes bore into Cassie, waiting for her to collapse under the weight of his words. Her chest tightened, fury and humiliation burning together in her throat. He wasn't offering her money, he was baiting her into surrendering her pride. If she danced and stumbled, he would ruin her. If she refused, she would confirm her supposed place beneath him. Either way, he thought he had trapped her. For a moment, her fear nearly crushed her. She thought of her father at home, lying in his worn armchair, the pile of hospital bills on the kitchen counter. She thought of all the nights she had walked home barefoot, her body aching, her spirit exhausted. And then she thought of something else. The stage lights she once knew, the music that had once flowed through her veins, the proud words her father had whispered years ago. Cassie, why? You were born to shine. Never forget that. Preston leaned in, his blue eyes cold as ice. So, Cassandra, do you accept? Or will you scurry off like a frightened little mouse? Cassie's pulse hammered in her ears. She drew a long, slow breath, her trembling hands tightening around the tray until the silver edge dug into her palms. Then, slowly, she lifted her chin and met his gaze head-on. Her voice, when it came, rang clear and defiant, echoing through the charged silence of the ballroom. I accept your challenge, Mr. Montgomery. A ripple of shock swept through the crowd. The orchestra faltered, the notes hanging awkwardly in the air. Preston blinked just for a fraction of a second, surprise flashing behind his smug mask. He had not expected her to fight back. But Cassandra Riley had just stepped across a line that could never be uncrossed. The room held still, as if the very chandeliers above had frozen in mid-glitter, their light suspended on crystal edges. Preston's challenge lingered in the air, sharp and merciless, but it was Cassie's answer that had truly stunned the crowd. I accept your challenge, Mr. Montgomery. The words echoed, hanging like a defiant flame in a room that had never heard such boldness from someone dressed in black and white linen. For a moment, Preston's smirk faltered. It was only for a breath, a crack in his polished mask, but Cassie caught it. He hadn't expected her to agree. He had expected tears, retreat, a bowed head. But instead, she stood in front of him, her chin lifted, her eyes unflinching, her pride like steel beneath the crushing weight of 100 stares. The silence broke in ripples. Murmurs darted across the room like sparks catching dry wood. Did she just say yes? She can't be serious. $10,000, she'll embarrass herself. Others leaned forward, captivated, as though they were about to witness a gladiator thrown to the lions. The orchestra players exchanged uneasy glances, their bows hovering above their strings, waiting for someone to signal what would happen next. Cassie's chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Her heart was pounding so violently it threatened to break free, but her face betrayed none of it. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate, and walked toward a side table. With the composure of someone stepping onto a stage, she set the silver tray down, the glasses rattling faintly against the polished surface. Then, with careful hands, she untied her apron. The room watched in silence as she folded the apron neatly, laying it beside the tray. It was not an apron she was removing. It was the weight of invisibility, the uniform of servitude, the role she had worn for years. Her movements were not rushed, not desperate. They were ceremonial, almost sacred, like an offering of the life she had endured for too long. Then she bent down. Her hands moved to the worn black shoes on her aching feet, the shoes that had carried her through 16-hour shifts and countless indignities. Slowly, she slipped them off and placed them gently beneath the table. The moment her bare feet touched the silk carpet, something stirred inside her. A flicker of life she thought had been extinguished forever. The softness beneath her soles reminded her of the spring of a stage floor, of point shoes gripping wood, of music carrying her across air. Gasps swept through the crowd. To them, this was audacity, defiance in its purest form. Preston blinked again, his smirk hardening as he tried to mask his brief unease. Veronica's frozen smile cracked into irritation. Blake and Austin's laughter faltered, caught off guard by the quiet gravity of the moment. Cassie straightened, her chin high, her eyes blazing with something no one in that room had expected to see: confidence. She was no longer the invisible waitress weaving between their tables. She was a woman who had once known the stage, and in that instant, she reclaimed it. Preston stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow across her. "Are you certain you want to do this, Cassandra?" he asked, his voice low, his smirk curling again. "If you falter, if you stumble even once, this little performance will cost you everything. Your job, your dignity, everything." Cassie didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on, her voice carrying across the hall with clarity that silenced the last murmurs. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Mr. Montgomery." Her words struck like a hammer. A shiver ran through the crowd. For the first time, some of them shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, as if questioning whether this was still entertainment or the beginning of something much larger. Cassie walked toward the center of the ballroom, the chandeliers above raining light down on her like 1,000 golden spotlights. Her steps were calm, deliberate, her every movement infused with quiet power. She stopped in the middle of the dance floor, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. The hush in the room deepened. The orchestra, sensing the weight of the moment, readied themselves. Preston joined her at last, striding into the center with his arrogance wrapped tight around him. But there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of uncertainty he could not quite disguise. Cassie inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years of lost dreams rise to the surface. She could almost hear her father's voice whispering from the shadows of memory. "Cassie, you were born to shine." And under the glittering chandeliers of the Grand Atoria, she knew she was no longer standing there as a servant. She was standing there as herself, Cassandra Riley, dancer, fighter, and daughter of a man who had taught her that dignity was worth more than gold. The music was about to begin, and so was the battle. The first notes of the tango slipped into the air, low and sultry, curling around the chandeliers like smoke. The violins carried the rhythm with deliberate intensity, and the room seemed to shrink as every pair of eyes fixed on the unlikely couple standing in the center of the ballroom. Preston Montgomery III extended his hand with a flourish, his smirk gleaming with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Cassie placed her hand in his, her touch steady despite the firestorm inside her chest. The crowd leaned forward, hungry. For them, this was entertainment, a waitress about to be humiliated before the city's elite. Preston's friends grinned, whispering predictions of her inevitable failure. Veronica watched with narrowed eyes, her smile sharp as glass, already salvo. Ring the spectacle. But Cassie was not thinking of them. She was listening to the music, letting it seep into her bones, feeling it pulse through her veins like the lifeblood of a forgotten dream. Preston yanked her forward into the opening stance, his grip firm, his movements bold, every step designed to command dominance. His body spoke arrogance, each gesture saying, "I own this floor, I own this moment, I own you." He led with sweeping flourishes, snapping turns, deliberately pushing her into complicated steps he assumed would tangle her feet. The audience chuckled as Cassie allowed herself to stumble slightly, her balance faltering just enough to feed his pride. "Careful, Cassandra," Preston murmured mockingly, his lips curling as he leaned close to her ear. "Wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself too soon." Laughter rippled through the room at the sight of her apparent awkwardness. A few guests even clapped sarcastically, amused by her supposed clumsiness. Blake and Austin roared with delight, elbowing each other as if they were watching a play unfold exactly as scripted. Veronica covered her mouth with her jeweled hand, eyes glittering with triumph, convinced that Cassie's dignity was about to be crushed under the weight of Preston's performance. But beneath Cassie's calm face, something deliberate was happening. Every stumble, every falter was intentional. She was letting him believe he was in control, feeding his arrogance, luring him deeper into his own pride. With each step, she studied him, not just his rhythm, but the stiffness in his body, the overconfidence in his movements. He was powerful, yes, but graceless. He moved with force, not finesse, with pride, not passion. And Cassie knew the tango was not about power, it was about control, balance, and fire. The music swelled, violins crying louder, the rhythm tightening. Cassie drew in a steady breath, her eyes flashing with something Preston didn't notice. Yet, she let him spin her roughly, her body yielding for the moment. But she was no longer stumbling, she was measuring, waiting, preparing. "Look at her," Veronica whispered to a woman beside her, her voice carrying just enough for Cassie to hear. "A clumsy girl playing at grace. This will be over soon." The words should have stung, but Cassie didn't let them in. Instead, she closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, shutting out the sneers, shutting out the crowd. She remembered another floor, another kind of light, the spring of wood beneath her shoes, the hush of an audience holding its breath, her father's proud eyes watching from the dark. She could almost hear him now. "Cassie, don't let anyone steal your rhythm. It's yours, always yours." When she opened her eyes, her gaze locked on Preston's smug expression. He was certain he had her cornered, certain she was about to collapse in front of them all, and that certainty would be his undoing. The music built toward its first crescendo. Preston pulled her into a sharp dip, expecting her to falter, to stumble as she had before. But Cassie's body bent with effortless grace, her balance unshakable, her eyes fixed on his with defiance burning hot. The crowd gasped. For a fleeting instant, Preston's smugness wavered, confusion flickering in his eyes. Cassie rose smoothly from the dip, her movements no longer those of a stumbling server, but of a dancer who knew the floor as well as she knew her own heartbeat. Barefoot, she felt every vibration of the music through the silk carpet, each note guiding her steps with precision. She wasn't following anymore. She was preparing to lead. The room didn't know it yet. Preston didn't know it yet, but the tide was beginning to turn. And with the next swell of the violins, Cassandra Riley would no longer be just a waitress. She would become the storm that shook the Grandatoria to its core. The violins sharpened, their notes slicing through the air, like fire catching dry wood, and in that instant Cassie felt the rhythm surge into her bloodstream. It was as if the music itself had been waiting for her, pulling her forward, demanding she stop hiding in the shadows. Preston's grip was still firm, arrogant, commanding, but his confidence had blinded him. He thought he was leading, thought he had her trapped in his performance, but Cassie's eyes had changed. The fear that had once flickered there was gone. In its place burned a spark of defiance, fierce and unyielding. Preston lunged into a showy flourish, snapping her into a fast turn meant to throw her off balance. The crowd chuckled, anticipating her stumble. But Cassie didn't stumble. She spun with perfect control, her body fluid and precise, her movements sharper than the chandelier's reflections on the marble floor. When she stopped, her gaze locked onto Preston's, steady and unshaken. For the first time all night, his smirk faltered. The music climbed, passionate and demanding, and Cassie seized it. She let go of the meek steps, the feigned clumsiness, and drew on the training buried deep within her muscles. Years at Donovan Academy, years of living for the stage, years of sacrifice that had never stripped her of the fire inside. Every lesson came rushing back like a tide. Her body remembered what her heart had never forgotten. She moved now, not as a servant following a master, but as a dancer reclaiming her place beneath the light. Her feet glided barefoot across the silk carpet, each step precise, her balance effortless. She countered Preston's every forceful lunge with fluid grace, twisting his arrogance into clumsiness. The crowd gasped as he faltered, scrambling to keep pace, his polished shoes slipping slightly against the floor. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Veronica's smile cracked, her jeweled hand lowering from her lips as disbelief washed across her face. Blake and Austin's laughter died mid-breath, replaced by stunned silence. The murmurs of the crowd swelled into awe, voices rising as they realized this was no clumsy server fumbling for dignity. This was a dancer, a woman forged by fire, unleashing a skill no one had expected to see. Cassie's chest heaved, her breath syncing perfectly with the pulse of the music. She no longer felt the chandeliers or the marble floor or the hundreds of eyes upon her. She felt only the rhythm, the fire inside, the ghost of applause she had buried years ago. Every spin, every step, every sharp movement was a declaration. I am not invisible. I am not yours to mock. I am Cassandra Riley, and I was born for this. Preston stumbled again, his face reddening, sweat beading at his temples. His grip tightened on her arm, desperate to pull control back into his hands, but Cassie twisted effortlessly out of it, guiding him instead, her body leading his. The crowd erupted in astonished murmurs. It was no longer Preston's performance. It was hers. He was the puppet, dragged along by her grace, his arrogance unraveling with every falter. The violin soared higher, the piano crashing into a passionate crescendo. Cassie seized the moment, executing a breathtaking spin, her dress fanning out around her, her bare feet striking the carpet like a drumbeat of defiance. The room gasped, the applause already beginning to stir before the music had even ended. In Preston's eyes, panic flickered for the first time. He had orchestrated this moment to humiliate her, to crush her spirit before the wealthy elite. Instead, he had given her a stage, a spotlight, and a chance to remind herself, and everyone watching, who she truly was. As the final notes of the crescendo blazed through the ballroom, Cassie surged into control, her movements fierce and flawless. Preston struggled behind her, clumsy and graceless, his humiliation written in every stumble. And then, with the entire room spellbound, Cassandra Riley lifted her head, her eyes blazing with the fire of someone who had risen from ashes and took the Grand Atoria ballroom for herself. The chandeliers blazed like 1,000 suns above them as the tango thundered into its climax. Every eye in the Grand Atoria was locked on the center of the floor where Preston Montgomery III and Cassandra Riley moved, though to anyone watching closely, it was no longer Preston leading. It was Cassie. Barefoot, her body flowed like fire, each step fierce and precise, every motion filled with the kind of control only born from years of training and pain. The crowd, which had moments earlier laughed at her, now sat in stunned silence. Gasps slipped through lips, fans lowered to laps, champagne glasses forgotten on linen-covered tables. The arrogant heir they had come to admire, the man who thought himself untouchable, was stumbling, scrambling, humiliated before their eyes. And the waitress they had never noticed until this moment had become a force of nature, commanding the entire ballroom with the sheer weight of her grace. Cassie's eyes burned with defiance. She spun into a flawless pirouette, the hem of her uniform skirt flaring around her legs like a dancer's costume reborn. Preston lunged to catch up, but his movements were heavy, graceless, clumsy. His polished shoes slid awkwardly against the carpet, his once perfect hair beginning to fall out of place. Each mistake drew sharper breaths from the audience. The room was turning, and Cassie felt it. The violins wailed higher, the piano thundered deeper, and Cassie seized the crescendo. She snapped Preston into a daring dip, the reversal of roles so shocking that the entire room gasped aloud. She held him there, her hand firm on his shoulder, her face inches from his, her eyes fierce and unyielding. For the first time in his life, Preston Montgomery III looked small. Veronica's jeweled hand clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her eyes wide with disbelief and fury. Blake and Austin, moments ago laughing at Cassie's supposed clumsiness, now sat frozen, their smug grins erased. Around the ballroom, whispers surged, astonishment and awe replacing cruelty. She's incredible. Look at her. She's not just dancing. She's dominating. That girl. Who is she? Cassie heard none of it. All she heard was the music, the rhythm pounding through her veins, the phantom roar of applause she had longed for since she was 17. Her father's voice echoed inside her. Cassie, you were born for the stage. Don't let anyone steal your dream. The final notes of the tango soared, every violin string pulled tight, every piano chord struck with fire. Cassie spun out of Preston's grip, her body a blur of power and beauty before snapping back into the final pose. Preston stumbled, barely catching himself while she stood tall, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing, her breath steady despite the storm inside her. The room erupted. Applause crash. Ed through the ballroom like thunder rolling over a valley. Guests leapt to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even whistling, their eyes shining with awe and admiration. The same people who had laughed at her moments ago now looked at her with reverence, unable to tear their eyes away from the waitress who had become a star before their very eyes. Preston stood beside her, his chest heaving, his face crimson with humiliation. Sweat gleamed on his forehead, his smug mask shattered. He glanced toward Veronica for support, but she looked away, her expression stiff with embarrassment. Blake and Austin avoided his eyes entirely, their loyalty vanishing as quickly as their laughter had. Cassie stood still, breathing deeply, her bare feet rooted to the silk carpet, her pride burning brighter than the chandeliers above. She had not just survived his challenge, she had conquered it. And in doing so, she had turned Preston's arrogance into ashes. The music faded into silence, but the applause did not stop. It grew louder, fiercer, the sound of hundreds of voices united in one truth. They had witnessed something unforgettable. Cassandra Riley, the invisible waitress, had stolen the spotlight from Preston Montgomery III and left him stripped of his power. And as she stood there, radiant beneath the chandeliers, Cassie knew one thing with certainty. She would never again allow anyone to decide her worth. The thunder of applause shook the walls of the Grand Atoria ballroom, echoing through every gilded corner. Cassie stood in the center of it all, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths, her chin lifted, her bare feet planted firmly on the silk carpet. She had done it. She had silenced the laughter. She had seized the music, and she had reclaimed the piece of herself she thought was lost forever. For one glorious moment, she felt like the dancer she had once been, the girl her father had believed in, the young woman who was born for the stage. But applause has a way of cutting deeper than silence, and for Preston Montgomery III, it sliced through him like a blade. He stood beside her, panting, his tuxedo clinging with sweat, his perfect hair falling loose across his forehead. The cheers weren't for him. They weren't for his power, his money, or his arrogance. They were for her, the woman he had tried to humiliate. His face flushed crimson, his jaw tight with fury. He could feel their stares, not with admiration, but with mockery. In that moment, Preston Montgomery wasn't the heir to an empire, wasn't the man who thought he owned the room. He was the fool who had been led across the dance floor like a puppet, undone by the very person he had meant to destroy. The applause still roared when his hand shot into his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out the thick stack of cash he had brandished earlier. Without hesitation, he hurled it at the floor. The bills scattered across the carpet like fallen leaves, some fluttering against Cassie's bare feet. The sound of money hitting silk was sharp, final, ugly. The room gasped. The applause broke into silence, replaced by stunned murmurs. "There's your money," Preston spat, his voice low but venomous, trembling with humiliation. "Take it. You've earned it. Isn't that what you wanted?" The words dripped with scorn, but his voice cracked ever so slightly. He was no longer mocking. He was desperate, clinging to the last weapon he had left, wealth. If he could not crush her dignity with ridicule, then perhaps he could bury it under the weight of $10,000. Cassie's gaze dropped to the bills strewn across the floor. $10,000, enough to pay for her father's treatment, enough to buy her family time, enough to free her from endless nights of servitude. For one brief aching moment, her chest tightened, her knees weakening at the sight. That money could change everything. But then she felt it. The eyes of the crowd, heavy, waiting, measuring. They weren't looking at the money, they were looking at her. And in their gaze, she saw something she had never been given before in this room. Respect. Not pity, not mockery, not indifference. Respect. If she bent now, if she lowered herself to gather those bills, that respect would vanish. She would lose everything she had fought for in the last few minutes. She would become, once again, what Preston believed her to be. Bought, owned, humiliated. Cassie inhaled deeply, her spine straightening, her head lifting higher than it ever had in this ballroom. Her voice rang out clear and steady, slicing through the thick silence. "I don't need your money, Mr. Montgomery." The room froze. "That dance wasn't about earning anything from you," she continued, her eyes blazing as they locked onto his. "It was about proving that I am not your toy to mock or discard. My dignity is not for sale." Her words hit like thunder. The crowd gasped, then erupted again. Not with laughter, not with whispers, but with applause so loud it shook the chandeliers. People rose to their feet, clapping fiercely, some even cheering her name, Cassandra Riley, the waitress who had refused to bow. Preston stood rigid, his fists clenched, his face burning with humiliation as the crowd's thunderous approval washed over her. His plan had crumbled into ashes before his eyes. He had given her a stage, and she had stolen it from him. Cassie turned, her steps slow but certain, her bare feet brushing past the scattered bills. She did not look down again. Each stride toward the ballroom's grand doors was accompanied by the roar of applause that followed her like a tide. By the time she reached the golden arches, tears pricked her eyes, not from shame, but from something far stronger: pride, vindication, freedom. Behind her, Preston Montgomery stood among the ruins of his arrogance, his reputation cracking under the weight of a single truth. He had tried to break her, but instead, he had made her unforgettable. The ballroom's golden doors closed behind Cassie with a soft thud, sealing in the thunder of applause that still echoed like a storm in her ears. Her heart raced, her breaths came fast, but her steps were steady as she walked down the velvet-lined corridor. She hadn't touched $1 of the bills scattered on the carpet, and though her father's hospital bills loomed in her mind like a mountain, she knew, deep in her soul, that no sum of money was worth bowing to a man like Preston Montgomery. But even as she left the Grand Atoria, her story was not ending. It was only beginning. Inside the ballroom, amid the chaos, one man's camera had never stopped clicking. Nathaniel Crow, Nate to his friends, was a freelance photographer, hired that night to capture glamorous portraits of New York's elite sipping champagne beneath chandeliers. But when Preston Montgomery had stood and issued his cruel dare, Nate had raised his lens, and when Cassie shed her apron, slipped off her shoes, and stepped barefoot onto the ballroom floor, his camera had followed. Now, as the applause thundered and Preston stood humiliated, Nate scrolled through the images on the glowing screen of his camera. Frame after frame leapt out at him, Cassie's defiant chin raised as she accepted the challenge, the bare feet on silk carpet, the fire in her eyes as she spun across the floor. Preston's face, once smug, now twisted in humiliation as he stumbled behind her. And finally, the moment that froze Nate's breath, the photograph of Cassie standing tall, her gaze fierce, while Preston hurled money at her feet. That image said everything. The arrogance of wealth, the dignity of defiance. It was more than a picture. It was a story, a symbol. Without hesitation, Nate slipped out of the ballroom and into the cool New York night. On a bench beneath the glow of a street lamp, he connected his camera to his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. He uploaded the photographs to social media, each caption carefully chosen. Cassandra Riley, a waitress mocked by billionaire heir Preston Montgomery III, turned his cruelty into her stage. Tonight, she danced, not for money, but for dignity. Then, with one final click, the story was live. At first it trickled, a few shares, a handful of comments, but then the photograph, the one of Cassie standing tall with bills scattered around her feet, caught fire. Thousands shared it within minutes. Hashtags exploded across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Hashtag justice for Cassie, hashtag Montgomery, shame, dignity can't be bought. By midnight, the images had gone viral. Celebrities weighed in. "This young woman is a queen," one actress tweeted, her words shared 500,000 times in an hour. News outlets scrambled to grab the story. Headlines blazed across the internet. Arrogant heir humiliated by waitress in stunning dance showdown. Black waitress rejects $10,000 to defend her dignity. Montgomery Empire heir brought down by his own cruelty. Donations began pouring into a GoFundMe set up by strangers under the name Justice for Cassie. The goal had been $10,000, the exact amount Preston had thrown at her feet. Within hours, it climbed past $50,000. By dawn, it had surpassed 6 figures. Meanwhile, in the glass tower of Montgomery Corporation, chaos erupted. Executives huddled in emergency meetings as news anchors replayed the photographs and video clips of the gala again and again. Investors demanded answers. Stock prices began to slide. The Montgomery name, once untouchable, was drowning in scandal. And Preston himself? He had locked his apartment door, his phone buzzing non-stop with calls he refused to answer. Each time he dared to glance at the screen, another headline, another viral clip, another storm of scathing comments cut into him. His humiliation was no longer confined to a ballroom, it was broadcast to the entire world. But across town, in a modest Queens apartment, Cassie sat by her father's side. James Riley had watched the story unfold on TV, his eyes filling with tears as he listened to commentators call his daughter a hero, a symbol of strength. He reached for her hand, his voice rough with emotion. "Cassie, I told you, you were born to shine." For the first time in years, Cassie believed it again. And as the city buzzed with her name, as the world rallied to her side, she understood one truth with unshakable certainty. She had not just stood up to Preston Montgomery, she had stood up to a system that thrived on silence, and she had broken it open with a single dance. The storm had begun, and Cassandra Riley was its center. The city woke the next morning already humming with Cassie's name. News anchors replayed the viral clips every hour, her face illuminated on every screen from Times Square billboards to tiny diner televisions in Queens, the image of her standing tall while money lay south. Cattered at her feet had become a symbol, something far greater than one woman's defiance. It was dignity embodied. And while the world lifted Cassie onto its shoulders, the Montgomery Empire was crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. At the Montgomery Corporation headquarters, a building of glass and steel that once exuded power, chaos reigned. Phones rang off the hook. Lawyers stormed in and out of conference rooms. Investors demanded explanations as stock prices continued to spiral downward. Inside the largest boardroom, Richard Montgomery sat at the head of a long mahogany table, his face ashen, his jaw clenched tight. The patriarch of the empire, a man who had built an untouchable fortune over 4 decades, now stared at the screen replaying his son's disgrace over and over again. The clip cut between Cassie's triumphant stance and Preston's humiliated face. Richard's eyes narrowed with each replay, the lines of fury deepening across his face. At last, he slammed a fist against the polished table. Enough. The screen flickered to black, but silence hung heavier than the echo of his outburst. Around him, his executives shifted uncomfortably, no one daring to speak. "Where is my son?" Richard demanded. "Still refusing calls," one aide replied softly. Richard's nostrils flared. "Get him here. Now." Hours later, Preston entered the boardroom like a man walking into a funeral. Gone was the polished arrogance, the untouchable smirk. His tuxedo from the night before hung wrinkled, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. The room of executives stared at him with thinly veiled contempt, their empire now sinking because of his pride. Richard rose slowly, his towering figure radiating disappointment more crushing than rage. "Do you even grasp what you've done, Preston?" His voice was low, controlled, but every syllable struck like a lash. "One night, one act of cruelty, and you've made this family the face of arrogance, racism, and humiliation in front of the world." Preston swallowed hard, words failing him. I didn't mean..." "Didn't mean?" Richard snapped, his voice booming. "You mocked a woman in front of hundreds. You threw money at her feet like she was dirt. And now?" He gestured sharply at the empty black screen. "Now the world cheers her and despises us. You've destroyed everything I built. Everything." Preston lowered his eyes, shame burning his face. For the first time in his life, he had no defense. His friends had abandoned him. His fiancée had left him. The world had turned on him. And now even his father, the one man who had always excused his arrogance, looked at him with nothing but cold fury. The board members shifted, their patience at its end. One finally spoke, her tone cutting. "Mr. Montgomery, with respect, the damage is beyond repair. The public doesn't want statements. They want accountability. The only way forward is leadership change. Both Montgomerys must step aside." A murmur of agreement rippled across the room. Richard's face hardened. For decades, he had been untouchable, but now the tide was against him, and even he could not fight it. After a long, suffocating silence, he nodded once, bitterly. "Then so be it." Preston's stomach twisted. "Father, be silent," Richard cut him off sharply. "You have nothing left to say." As the board members filed out, whispers of lawsuits and criminal probes trailing behind them, Richard sank heavily into his chair. He had spent a lifetime building an empire of glass towers, but his son's arrogance had turned it into sand. Meanwhile, across the city, Cassandra Riley sat at a small cafe with Nate, the photographer whose photos had captured the world. She sipped her coffee slowly, the reality of her newfound recognition sinking in. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from strangers, reporters, and celebrities offering support, but Cassie's eyes widened when Nate slid his phone across the table toward her. On the screen was an email. The sender, Gregory Bishop, the legendary Broadway director known for discovering stars. The subject line, "We need to talk about your future." Cassie's breath caught. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the words inside. "Your performance at the gala was extraordinary. The world saw it. I saw it. I am working on a new production, Phoenix Rising, a story of resilience, courage, and rebirth. And I believe you were born to play the lead. Let's meet." Her vision blurred with tears. For years, her dream had been buried under hospital bills and humiliation. But now, because of her defiance, because she had chosen dignity over money, the dream was alive again, bigger and brighter than ever. "Cassie," Nate said softly, smiling at her, "you're not just a story anymore. You're a symbol, and symbols can't be erased." She looked up, her eyes shining with a fire she hadn't felt in years. The humiliation Preston had tried to trap her with had backfired. She had not only walked away with her pride intact, she had walked into her destiny. And across town, in the silence of his penthouse, Preston Montgomery sat alone, his phone buzzing with endless notifications of scorn and ridicule. He scrolled through image after image of Cassie, radiant and strong, the world lifting her higher while he sank deeper into disgrace. For the first time in his privileged life, Preston understood the weight of irreparable loss. He had tried to use his wealth to humiliate her. Instead, he had given her the stage, and the world would never let him forget it.